Okay folks, so thank you all so much for coming. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Matthew Jarron, I'm the museum curator here at the university, and I'm responsible for the exhibition that you've had a chance to have a look at, which is on until the 8th of February, so come back later on, tell your friends. So I've called this talk Rediscovering Nell Baxter, because really that's what we've been doing over the past year. And this really started a year ago when we were gifted a huge collection of her work. And prior to that, we really didn't know very much about her, despite the fact that actually, as hopefully I will demonstrate, she was quite a significant figure. And in fact, we didn't even know what she looked like, so it's been great to get some photos of her to put a face to the name, although they're all photos of her later in life. But yeah, so about a year ago, we were contacted by a relative of her family who offered us this wonderful folio with this lovely sort of embroidered title here, full of about 400 different drawings and designs by her. And it was a sort of wonderful treasure trove of goodies, basically, that we gradually started to go through and catalogue. And obviously that's allowed us to find out a lot more about her, but in many ways it's also raised more questions as well as answers. So we're still in the process, I think, of finding things out. But prior to that, really, pretty much the only thing that was known about her, if you Googled her name, pretty much the only thing that would come up would be her association with Patrick Geddes and John Duncan with the various Celtic Revival activities that they were undertaking in Edinburgh. Most notably, she was one of the illustrators who contributed to this journal, The Evergreen, and the various mural projects and so on. And I'll come back to talk a bit more about those later on. But beyond that, really very little was known about her work. So, let's go back to the beginning. This is her birth certificate. She was born on the 28th of May, 1874, at 97 Bucklemaker Wynd, and her parents are listed as Crichton Milne Baxter, linen manufacturer, and Anne Baxter, née Murray. So Bucklemaker Wynd, this is what it looked like in 1874, from the foot of the hill town, and as some of you may know, this is one of the streets that was completely rebuilt under the 1871 Improvement Act and turned into Victoria Road. And so her address then changed from 97 Bucklemaker Wynd to 97 Victoria Road. So presumably that means that her house wasn't torn down and rebuilt. It must be one of the newer ones further up the street. So what do we know about her father, Crichton Baxter? He was the son of George Handyside Baxter, the founder of a fairly small-scale textile manufacturing company, George H. Baxter and Son. And although, as you saw on the birth certificate, it was listed as linen manufacturer, actually the company mostly specialised in jute sacking. But he was also described as being an expert in chess and as a poet, painter and musician, so clearly he had all sorts of artistic interests as well as his actual business. And he married Anne Murray at Fordoun in Aberdeenshire in 1865. And that's just decided to go funny. There we go. So they had 4 daughters, of whom Helen very quickly became known as Nellie, and then later Nell was the third. But very sadly, when Nell, or Nellie, was only 7 years old, he died, as it says here, after a long period of failing health, which he bore with great patience. By that point, the family had moved further up Victoria Road at number 165. Couldn't actually find a photo of it. It's basically a block that was about to be built when this photo was taken on the right here, and was then later demolished. So I couldn't find any pictures of it. Tracing her school days is slightly tricky because there's at least 3 different Nellie Baxters all around in Dundee at the same time. It's a very common name then, which makes it slightly difficult to work out who's who. But she seems to have started at the high school. And this is a list of prize winners from 1885, and you'll see Nellie Baxter at the bottom there. But the name at the top there, Jessie Duncan, that's actually John Duncan's sister. So a possible interesting connection there. And then at some point she seems to have left the high school and moved to a private school in the Cowgate called Miss Sinclair's, which I know nothing about at all other than managing to find a couple of adverts in the newspapers. And she was there for an undeterminate length of time, but then in 1887 we know that she enrolled at Harris Academy, as it was in its original home in Park Place, and she was there until 1891. And at the end of that, she gained a prize of 10 shillings and sixpence, and also a free pass for the LLA examination. Now that was the Lady Laureate of Arts degree that was specifically introduced by the University of St Andrews for women students. But obviously she didn't go and study at St Andrews, she decided to pursue art as her career instead. She ends up studying evening classes in art at Harris Academy. They had a little sort of mini art school there, taught by the art master Robert Allen. And she makes her exhibition debut in 1890 at the Dundee Fine Art Exhibition, showing a still life, an oil painting. She then moves over to take further art evening classes at Morgan Academy, taught by their art master David Murray. And in 1892 she wins a prize at the Dundee Institute of Architecture in the class Sketches from the Antique in the Museum. She wins equal first prize for her sketch of Theseus. So this was doing sketches from the what was the old sculpture court in the Albert Institute, now the McManus, and Theseus is this chap here with the foot missing, and so she won the prize for that. And it tells us that this is the first time that a lady has obtained a prize offered by the Institute in the competition. So it's almost all men, needless to say, applying for these. So that was quite an achievement. She seems to have been involved in the Dundee Art Club, which was the main art organisation in Dundee in the 1880s. It was run largely by the illustrator Martin Anderson, later known as the cartoonist Cynicus, and he gave over his studio in Reform Street to become the main art rooms of the art club. But this is an invitation to the Mrs. Baxter, so Nellie and her sisters, to attend an at-home that he was giving in the studio. And you'll notice that in the sort of musical programme on the right, there is a song performed by Miss Baxter, because we don't know which of the Miss Baxters this is. But I think it's probably most likely to have been the eldest sister, Anne or Annie. Now she also started studying art. She studied at Dundee School of Art, which was the first kind of proper art school in the city, then based at the high school. She exhibited quite a lot actually at the Fine Art Exhibitions for several years, but then gave up art to become a professional musician. And supposedly she actually became a silent film accompanist at the Kinnaird Hall. But later on she married a chap called Joseph Eek, and both of them became very active in Labour politics, and I'll say a little bit about that later on because it's actually quite interesting. Now, the earliest surviving pieces that we have in this wonderful collection of stuff that we were given is this sketchbook, which you can sort of just about make out the name Nellie Baxter, 165 Victoria Road. So we know it must date from the late 1880s, early 1890s, which is when she was living there. And it's got some really beautiful little pencil sketches and watercolours in it of various different scenes. There's some really nice ones of possibly her sisters, maybe some of her friends on sketching trips. And quite a lot of these images are scenes in and around Tayport or Tentsmuir. And we know that around about 1894 the family left Dundee and moved out to Tayport to stay in this house, Mercury Cottage at Newport, in Newport Road in Tayport, confusingly. And it looks like quite a large building. It was actually split into two separate levels. We don't know which half they were in. One of the things we know about that house is that in 1896, the second Baxter sister, Alice, got married to a clerk, Peter Toms, at the house there. But by that point, 1896, Nell had already left to move to Edinburgh. And we're not exactly sure when she went, but she was definitely there by the beginning of 1895. So this is the point where we need to bring in these two key figures in the Celtic Revival movement, the botanist Patrick Geddes and the painter John Duncan. And just to sort of go back to give you a little bit of sort of origin to where the sort of Celtic Revival came from, there had been a sort of gradual growing interest in Gaelic culture, really going back to the 1780s with the publication of James Macpherson's poems of Ossian. So this purported to be translations of ancient Gaelic poetry by the bard, famous bard Ossian. In fact, it turned out he basically made all of it up, but that didn't really matter. It became this huge literary sensation, was translated all across Europe and made Scotland this amazing, fashionable place, and it's what led people like Mendelssohn and Beethoven and various others coming here. Then, of course, we get Walter Scott and the huge popularity of his poems and novels. And that then starts to feed into visual art, and so you get painters like John Thomson of Duddingston, for example, who take scenes of actual places and link them to scenes in Scott's novels. So this is actually a painting of Fast Castle in Berwickshire, but he's given it the title Wolf's Crag, which is the main setting of Scott's novel The Bride of Lammermoor. And so that is really one of the ways in which this whole sort of romantic Scottish landscape painting movement really built up. And then at the same time, there's an increasing interest in archaeology as a science and antiquarianism. There are new archaeological finds. There are sort of publications sort of documenting all of the ancient Pictish and early Celtic monuments and so on. So all of this stuff kind of feeds into this interest generally. That then, of course, itself has an impact on visual art, and so this very famous painting that's in Kelvin Grove by two of the Glasgow boys, Henry and Hornell, and the various different things that they're carrying and the emblems that they're wearing were all inspired by actual archaeological finds of the time. So Geddes was very much aware of all this, and he was so Geddes was trained as a botanist. And before obviously coming here to Dundee as Professor of Botany in 1888, he was working as a demonstrator at Edinburgh. And he was very much interested in applying the lessons of biology to people and to cities as a whole, and seeing cities as kind of organic systems that would evolve in the same way that organisms evolved. And he was really interested, therefore, in ideas of urban renewal. And in particular, he was very much opposed to the kind of new town thinking where everybody basically just abandoned the old town and built this sort of fancy new grid, the new town. And that was kind of completely the opposite of what he thought that cities should do. And so in 1886, he moved to Edinburgh's Old Town, which at that point was basically this horrendous, dilapidated slum. Nobody of any kind of good character would possibly live in the Old Town. So it was quite controversial at the time. And he began this sort of programme of urban renewal, initially through a group that he helped to found called the Edinburgh Social Union. And then he started holding these annual summer meetings where he would invite really important speakers from all different subjects from all over the world to come and speak in Edinburgh. It was kind of like the Edinburgh Festival of its day, really. And so gradually he was sort of doing all of these projects to basically renew the Old Town and bring a new sense of cultural identity to it. And he very much recognised the value of bringing art and design into the everyday lives of working people. And initially his influence was William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, but he later rejected that and decided instead to pursue his own agenda that he called the Celtic Renaissance. And he deliberately uses this rather archaic spelling of Renaissance because it's the kind of fancy thing he did. But the idea really was to kind of get Scotland away from all of the sort of kind of tartan, shortbread tin, kilt-wearing stuff, that sort of kitsch stuff culture that was very much symbolic of Scotland as North Britain, which is kind of generally what it was known as by that point, and take it back to this ancient Celtic past that linked Scotland not to England but to Ireland, Wales and mainland Europe as part of the shared Celtic culture. And he really thought that would help to kind of reinvigor Scotland and Scottish national identity. So it was a nationalist movement, but it was also an internationalist movement. He moved further up the Royal Mile to take over a house just below the Castle Esplanade, which had been the home of the poet Alan Ramsay. He did that up and started doing up the various properties around it, and eventually created this extraordinary sort of confectionery type conglomeration of buildings known as Ramsay Garden, which not only became his home but also a student hall of residence, the first of its kind in the UK. Because he very much believed that students and education should be at the heart of any kind of cultural renaissance. And as part of that, he founded his own art school, the Old Edinburgh School of Art, and this is why he wanted John Duncan, Dundee painter, to come and take over the running of this school. So Duncan was born in Dundee, in the Hilltown, in 1866. He studied at the Dundee School of Art and then went on to the continent to study further there, where he became really fascinated by symbolist painting. And he had a particular fascination for scenes of sort of mythology and fantasy. A lot of his early work comprised really beautifully delicate drawings and etchings of fairies and other sort of fantasy scenes like this. And Geddes very much recognised that he could sort of take that interest and channel it into an interest in Celtic mythology and legend. So Duncan takes over the running of the Old Edinburgh School of Art, and one of the things he introduces in 1895 is teaching a class in Celtic ornament, And you'll see it says there, conducted by Mr. John Duncan, assisted by Miss Helen Hay. So she was one of the pupils at the school that then he ended up taking on as an assistant. And it was to attend this class in Celtic ornament that we know that Nellie Baxter came to the school. And we have another of her early sketchbooks, which is presumably done at the time she was studying at the school, full of these wonderful detailed drawings, where she's obviously studying ancient Celtic monuments, where she's sort of recreating details from illuminated manuscripts, like the Book of Kells. But then the idea of all that was to then use that in practical ways that would actually ultimately be useful in the real world. So one of those is advertising. So we have a whole load of different advertising designs that presumably were student exercises. I'm pretty sure that Bovril didn't actually commission her to do this. There's all sorts of different ones. Maserati tea was a particularly popular brand at the time, and I particularly love Dr. Tibble's Vi Cocoa. So it was vitamin-enriched cocoa. So it was basically hot chocolate that's good for you. I mean, why on earth have they not done that since? What a great idea. And she was obviously particularly good because by October 1895, so basically by the next term, the class is now conducted by Helen Hay, assisted by Miss Helen Baxter. So she's now become an assistant teaching this class. And this leaflet actually tells us a little bit of interesting stuff about the class. It says it's intended for workmen and designers connected with all the various crafts in which Celtic ornament is at present or might be more extensively applied, e.g. those of the printer and bookbinder, the embroiderer, the jeweller, silversmith and brassworker, the blacksmith, the wood and stone carver, etc. And it goes on to say, it's hoped that the member of the various crafts may again assist in preparing designs adapted to their special materials and requirements, which may thus be of use in the industries of Edinburgh and of the Highlands. So they're very much thinking about practical ways in which these designs can be of use. Now the reason that Duncan was no longer teaching classes, he was now working full-time on various other projects for Geddes, of which the most ambitious was this series of murals that he painted in the common room of Ramsay Lodge, which was not just Geddes' home, but also the main meeting place for all the students that were staying in the Hall of Residence. So he created this whole series of murals based on scenes from Celtic legend, which Geddes described as the vastest and most elaborate Celtic illumination in the modern world. No more sustained and magnificent scheme of design and colour, no more vital symbolism has been produced by modern art in Scotland. Indeed, few such anywhere. Now, one of the interesting things about these murals is the murals themselves do still exist, but what doesn't exist, sadly, are all the beautiful decorative borders around them. And it was those that Nell Baxter and Helen Hay and others created for Duncan. And again, in the collection, we have a lot of her original designs for these, which are really interesting. And a lot of them in colour, which is particularly nice to see because those photos are all in black and white. And one of the things that's really nice about these is a lot of them actually are annotated by Duncan himself. So on this one he's written colouring awful, which is quite nice colouring, but there you go. He was obviously very strict. This one's particularly nice. He's written naughty Miss Baxter, and then goes on to complain that she's repeated a fault that he'd corrected in something else before. The other thing that she was involved with was The Evergreen, which was an extraordinary publication. It was a seasonal periodical. There were 4 issues published between 1895 and 1897, each one representing a particular season. And it was full of all sorts of interesting essays covering all sorts of different subjects in a typically sort of wide-ranging fashion, as you would expect from Geddes, but all themed around particular seasons. John Duncan acted as the art editor and was producing extraordinary graphic pieces like these, which are not only drawing on Celtic imagery and Art Nouveau style of the time, but really clearly show that Duncan was very much engaging with the latest modern art coming out of the continent. So this is the kind of stuff that we see in art journals in Vienna or Germany at the time. And it's very much really looking forward to the much more sort of streamlined style of Art Deco, for example. So this is really cutting edge stuff. But as well as him doing his own illustrations, he was also getting the various students from the Old Edinburgh School of Art to create pieces for him. And Nellie Baxter contributes to 3 of the 4. She's starting with the 2nd issue, and in fact she does more and more in each subsequent issue. So obviously Duncan recognised her particular talent. So she's creating a lot of these little head and tail pieces, and again we have several of the original pencil designs for these in the collection, which is just amazing to see these. And indeed various other works that she did that weren't actually ended up being used. And as well as illustrating the Evergreen, she's also producing illustrations for various other publications that Geddes was producing at the time. He had set up this publishing company, Patrick Geddes and colleagues, to produce all sorts of pieces of Celtic literature. In 1896, the school held an exhibition of the various work that had been done there, including showing off the various murals, as you can see here, showing off the various decorations from the Evergreen, but also various other pieces as well. So for example, book cover designs. There's one called Auld Lang Syne that she did. Designs for tablecloths by a Dunfermline manufacturer, and designs for linoleums for a Kirkcaldy firm. So again, this is going back to how the whole point of doing this was to then have a use in industry. And we have that book cover in the collection. Here it is, Auld Lang Syne. We have a tablecloth design that may or may not be that tablecloth design, and we have a linoleum design that may or may not be that linoleum design. She was doing various other things while she was in Edinburgh, so she designed the seal for the School of Medicine that was run jointly by the Royal Colleges of Physicians and Surgeons, and various other projects that we know about. One of the reasons that we know quite a bit about what she was doing at this time is thanks to this rather lovely book, which purports to be an accounts book from the Craig Miller Steam Laundry, which is obviously where she was doing her washing. But inside, it's actually a list of all the different projects that she was undertaking between 1897 and 1899. Sadly, we don't have any other books like this, but it just gives us that brief glimpse into all the various things that she was doing. And this is a really important period because this was the time when she actually left Edinburgh and came back to Dundee. Basically, she was following John Duncan. He was increasingly recognising that the various projects that Geddes was commissioning to do were increasingly short of money, and he was a bit fed up of not getting paid, not being able to pay all of the assistants like Nellie that he was supposed to be doing. And so in 1897 he decided to leave Edinburgh and come back to Dundee, and Nellie followed him back up here. But the various things that are listed here, some of them we've been able to tie into things that we've been given, some of them we haven't. But for example, the one on the top left there, it says, made a pen and ink drawing for Scottish cyclist, title May I Come. And that's this piece on the left here. So she was obviously commissioned by this magazine, The Scottish Cyclist, to produce a series of illustrations of lady cyclists. And this was, very kind of up to the minute, because it really just come into fashion that ladies could sort of go off on bicycles. And it was very much a symbol of the freedom of the new woman of the time to be able to do that. So this is quite progressive stuff. So Duncan and Nellie come back to Dundee, and Duncan, of course, is greatly enthused by all the stuff he's done with Geddes, and very keen to try to awaken a huge enthusiasm with the Celtic Revival to his fellow artists in Dundee, and see if he can kind of repeat a lot of the stuff that was going on in Edinburgh up here. So, where was the Celtic Revival in Dundee at that point? Well, actually, it was already quite far advanced, because Dundee, of course, had been a Gaelic-speaking town for several centuries, in fact. It was very strongly pro-Jacobite, at least more so in the first uprising than the second. There was a Gaelic church in Dundee, there was a Gaelic school in Dundee, and a whole load of different Highland and Celtic societies were formed during the 19th century, of which the main one by the time that Duncan came back was the Dundee Highland Society, which was officially formed in 1898, although it was a rebranding of an earlier society. And that society published an annual, the Celtic Annual, which was edited by the Society's treasurer, Malcolm MacLeod, but he also acted as a publisher on his own and produced a whole series of different Gaelic publications of songs and poems and children's books and various other things in both Gaelic and English. So a huge body of work. And generally there was a sort of fashion for all things Celtic at the time. So here's a big grand Celtic bazaar that was held at the Victoria Galleries to raise money for Clippington Parish Church. And so, essentially Duncan arrives back and he's kind of knocking on an open door because there's already a real enthusiasm for this kind of thing. By that time, the main artistic body in Dundee was the Graphic Arts Association, which was founded in 1890. Duncan had been one of the founder members. By that time, the Dundee Art Club had folded. And so he goes to his friends and fellow members of the Arts Association, tries to get them interested in embracing the Celtic Revival. And his two best chums in the association were two former fellow students of his, Stuart Carmichael and Alec Grieve. So the three of them had studied together at Dundee School of Art. They'd actually all gone down to work in London briefly together, and then they'd actually all gone to the continent, although at that point they all went to study in different art schools. But all of them became really fascinated by the symbolist art that was coming out of Europe at the time, and it's very clear from this early work by Carmichael, for example. But Carmichael gets particularly enthused about the Celtic Revival and immediately starts to adopt sort of Celtic imagery and scenes from Celtic mythology and from Scottish history, and indeed does that for the rest of his career. Alec Grieve, a lot of his work at that time was very symbolist, but his interest really was in political art. Both Carmichael and Grieve were very strong socialists. Carmichael indeed later became a very active nationalist, in fact was one of the founder members of the SNP when it started in the 20s. Grieve had worked for Keir Hardie as one of the illustrators on his publication, The Labour Leader, so was very actively involved in socialist politics. And so paintings like this that might seem to be just an ordinary farming scene were actually specifically intended as political allegories. And Grieve actually produced a line drawing of this with a slightly different composition that was published in a socialist journal, The Tocsin, that was edited and largely written by another Dundee artist, Joseph Lee. Now Lee, best known as a war poet, an illustrator, isn't really someone we associate with the Celtic Revival at all, but actually he was very actively involved in it. Like Carmichael, he became a member of the Dundee Highland Society. He illustrated a lot of pieces in the Celtic Annual and other publications for Malcolm MacLeod, so he does seem to have been really quite actively involved. But as well as the artists of Duncan's generation, he's also really keen to enthuse the new, younger artists that are just are coming out at that time. And probably the most extraordinary of those was George Dutch Davidson. Davidson was born in 1878, so 12 years younger than Duncan. And from very early on, he had this extraordinary sort of visionary quality to his work. So this is an amazing sort of mystical self-portrait that he produced, where his mind seems to be kind of coming out of his head and sort of going all over the place, and possibly a sort of aerial view of the Tay estuary maybe, but it's kind of sort of ever Munch-like sort of thing, quite extraordinary. And under Duncan's tutorage, he ended up creating these extraordinarily richly decorative pieces inspired by Celtic literature, including this one, The Hills of Dream, which is based on a poem by Fiona MacLeod, very popular Celtic Revival poet that was published by Geddes. So Davidson really became Duncan's main protege. He they shared a studio together in Albert Square. And here's an even more blatantly Celtic piece, this gorgeous illumination that he did on vellum. It must have taken absolutely ages. So this is kind of moving us away from fine art towards more decorative art. And this is really where Duncan sees the main potential of the Celtic Revival movement. And he writes to Geddes in 1898 saying, "In Dundee here, where I know everybody who does anything in an artistic way, I could easily get together a number of assistants to carry through any work that presented itself. We might form ourselves into a studio of design and undertake work of various kinds. Embroidery interests me very much, and wood carving. There's a kind of awakening in these things all the country over." So he gathers around him a group of talented young artists and designers, including George Dutch Davidson and Nell Baxter and her sister Rosa, also Elizabeth Burt, who was a cousin of Dutch Davidson's, Duncan's sister Jessie, who was now Mrs. Westbrook, and various others, are all excited by the Celtic Revival, but also generally interested in decorative and applied art. And they work in all sorts of different fields. Embroidery was definitely the most fashionable at the time, and so there's a couple of really nice pieces in the McManus's collection that were designed by Dutch Davidson and worked by his cousin Elizabeth Burt, both of which we have in the exhibition. But he's also working with Nell's sister Rosa as well. We're not sure whether these pieces survive, but there are photos of them. This is a detail from a piano front, and this gorgeous portfolio cover as well. So, to tell you a little bit more about Rosa Baxter, she also studied at Miss Sinclair's school, but then she went to the Morgan Academy rather than the Harris. It seems a bit odd to send your children to different schools, but that's what they did. And she then went on to study art evening classes at the Morgan. She first exhibits in 1898, and she was always known as Rose, although christened Rosa, and indeed from 1905 she exhibits as Rose as well. And we have this very grainy photo of her that was published in the newspaper at the time. So her exhibition debut was also really the debut of all of these new artists and designers and all of the kind of Celtic Revival work that they were producing under Duncan's influence. All came in that 1898 Graphic Arts Association exhibition. Stuart Carmichael designed the catalogue cover, but Nell Baxter designed a poster, of which we have this pencil sketch in the collection. She exhibited various works in that exhibition, including an illustration called The Little Mermaid's Farewell, which she'd actually created for a competition in the studio, the art magazine. We don't have the finished piece, unfortunately. We have various pencil sketches for it. Duncan chose two absolutely extraordinary paintings, both of which we have in our collection and they're in the exhibition. The Glaive of Light and A Sorceress, that are wonderfully sort of richly decorative pieces, quite unlike the later, much more sort of detailed tempera works that he's famous for. They almost have the sort of quality of sort of tapestry-like look about them. And they're both based on scenes of Celtic mythology, but they're also bringing in all sorts of other international influence as well. So, you know, this one almost has a sort of Gauguin, Polynesian sort of look about it. But you'll see both of these, the characters are wearing kimonos, so he's obviously being influenced by Japanese art as well. And of course both of them have these gorgeous Celtic-inspired frames as well that presumably Duncan designed himself. And Duncan is not just sort of informally teaching this group that are gathered around him, but he's also doing more formal teaching as well. In the art school at the YMCA, at the art school at the Technical Institute, which is what became DJ CAD, and also at the university as well. And that then inspires a lot of the art students of the time to also start incorporating Celtic imagery into their work. And so we have a couple of images of early art student work from the 1890s here. And just as he was working on mural projects in Edinburgh, so he very much kick-started a brief fashion for murals in Dundee as well. And he was commissioned by the Lord Dean of Guild, Paul, to create a series of murals for his house, Briarton Grove, at Magland Yard Road. The building still survives, but the murals don't, sadly. And Nell Baxter did this line drawing of the main panel that was published in the Piper of Dundee, but we actually know from that book that she was also actually helping Duncan with the murals themselves. And one of the really interesting things about this mural is that it was blatantly copied by Fran Newbery, famous head of Glasgow School of Art, for a mural that he did in Dorset 25 years later, which is rather extraordinary. But he's basically taken exactly the same composition, just changed the scene for a Dorset coast in the background there. Now, just after having completed that mural in 1900, Duncan leaves Dundee again, this time to go much further afield. Thanks to Geddes, he's appointed as Professor of Art at the Chicago Institute. He spends a few years there, is extremely unhappy about the whole thing, and then comes back to Scotland, settles in Edinburgh, and spends the rest of his career there, of course, painting the many gorgeous Celtic Revival paintings in tempera that you will no doubt be familiar with. He does occasionally come back to Dundee to do various projects, including painting the Reredos at St Mary's Church in Broughty Ferry in 1917. Now, 1900 was also an important year for Nell Baxter because she got married to this chap, John Kippen, who you see on the right here. This is obviously taken 30 years later. It's the only photo that we have of the two of them. What do we know about him? He was born in Crieff. He did teacher training and ended up coming to Dundee as a school teacher, first at Harris Academy, then second master at Blackness School. But he was obviously committed to sort of ongoing self-education, because he also took evening classes in Harris Academy at the same time as Nell Baxter was taking evening classes there. So possibly they might have met at that point, we don't know. However, he then goes and marries somebody else, Annie Sutherland in Aberdeen in 1890. They have a daughter, Catherine, or Cathy, who was born in 1894. He also starts teaching in the evenings at the Technical Institute that same year. But then tragedy strikes, and he dies aged just 36 in 1899. At that point, Kippen is living in Albert Street in Tayport, and Nell is still not very far away on Newport Road. We don't know the circumstances under which they met or re-met, but obviously, you know, Kippen has a 6-year-old daughter, and he's teaching full-time during the day and in the evenings, so he really needs somebody to look after her. So I'm sure that was possibly at least one of the impetuses to get married as quickly as he possibly could. So he marries Nell at Mercury Cottage in 1900, and just to sort of run through the rest of his career, he ends up getting various headmaster posts, ending up at Hawk Hill School. For many years he's also Commandant of Tayport Volunteer Training Corps. He retires in 1924 and devotes much of his time to nature study. He was a key member of the Dundee Nats, for example, and he died in 1937. Now, interestingly, of course, at that time, many husbands would have expected their wives to give up any career that they had and become full-time housewives, but thankfully he doesn't do that. He's very happy for her to continue working and to continue exhibiting. But from that point on, she exhibits as Helen Kippen. Whether he didn't like the nickname Nell, or whether she just thought it sounded better, she certainly continued to be known as Nell throughout the rest of her life, but she exhibits as Helen Kippen from this point onwards. And after Duncan leaves, there's a real fear that this sort of decorative art movement that he has inspired will kind of dissipate. And so to try to prevent that, the Graphic Arts Association formed a special decorative art section of the society in 1900, and 22 new members signed up to that. Interestingly, the Baxter sisters were not among them, although they did both exhibit regularly with the new section. Rose eventually joins in 1902, and then Nell in 1905, and by that point it had been renamed Dundee Art Society, which of course it still is today. And it's really at this point that the decorative art movement starts to get more official recognition, most obviously in 1908, when they're actually commissioned to create a city banner for Dundee. And 3 members of the group do that: Rose Baxter, Marion Carmichael, who was Stuart Carmichael's wife, and Elizabeth Laing, who was the wife of Frank Laing, another notable Dundee painter. The reason that this was commissioned was to be carried in the Scottish National Pageant in Edinburgh, which both Geddes and John Duncan were heavily involved with. It was carried by 2 Dundee school children wearing 11th century costume. It does still survive, although not in very good condition. It is in the McManus's collection, but as you see, it's covered in these rather nasty stains, so I don't think it's going to be displayed anytime soon, sadly. Helen and Rose do occasionally collaborate on various pieces, most notably this large embroidered panel which we have in the exhibition here called The Fairies, which was based on a poem by William Allingham, which was one of the poets that Geddes published in his anthology Lyra Celtica. And the finished piece is in Dundee Art Society's collection, but we have a number of different studies for it. She kind of endlessly goes over and over all the little details of it to get them just right before it could then be worked up by Rose. And it does seem that generally, while she liked designing embroidery, she obviously couldn't be bothered actually doing the embroidery, because generally embroidered pieces tend to be done by other people. So this is an example that the family have, which she designed and was worked by a lady called Mrs. Forbes Johnson. Here's a nice detail from it here. She's still doing commissioned work, so for example this is a prize certificate that she designed for Kirkcaldy Home Arts and Industries Association. This is quite interesting, a bookplate for the author Neil Munro, famous as the author of the Parahandy stories. We don't know how they knew each other. And this is a really interesting piece. This is a tea cosy design for embroidery. And one of the things that is interesting about this is that the main colours that are used here, purple, green and white, are of course the colours that were adopted in 1908 as the official suffragette colours by the Women's Social and Political Union. There are various suggestions as to why those were chosen, possibly give women votes, green, white, violet, but also the colours have their own symbolism, green symbolising hope, white symbolising purity, purple symbolising dignity. Now, it may just be a complete coincidence, she might have just liked those colours, but we do know that she did attend a women's suffrage meeting here at the university in 1906, so it was definitely something that she had an interest in. Now, in 1905, the Kippens moved to this house here, the Homestead in Grey Street, Tayport, so it's this one here, and they spent the rest of their lives there. And the photos that I've already shown you were taken in the back garden there. And there is a family album of various photos. So this is other members of the family. So, excuse me, Kippen, I mentioned that he had a daughter, Cathy, by his first marriage. So this is her grown up. She moved down to London and also became a school teacher, married this chap here, Lionel Parsons, and they had a daughter, Jean, who you see in both these photos here. And in fact, it was Jean's son, David, who gifted the collection to us. The most ambitious of her later works is this large-scale piece. Again, this was intended as a design for an embroidery, although as far as we know nobody ever embroidered it, called Where Oxlips and the Nodding Violet Grows, quotation from Midsummer Night's Dream, showing the fairy queen Titania. This is in the McManus's collection, but again we have various pencil studies for parts of it. And really thereafter she becomes far less prolific. This is all of the pieces we know of by either her or Rose after 1918, so really only a handful of pieces, and the last one we know about is in 1934. So you'll notice a couple of examples of embossed leather here. Those might be these pieces here that we have, but she had also done earlier leather work as well, so we're not sure if these are those or not. But you know, she was still doing this kind of Celtic Revival stuff, you know, many years after it was fashionable, and it was definitely the case that critics by this point started to notice that their work was becoming increasingly old-fashioned. So this is a courier review of the Dundee Art Society exhibition in 1927. It says, "Very charming is a tablecloth by Miss Rose Baxter, even if its tender Burne-Jones-like tones are overpowered by the higher note of the very modern embroidery shown by Miss Paxton Brown." So that's Helen Paxton Brown, who was known as one of the Glasgow girls, friend and contemporary of Jessie M. King, and she was noted for doing very modern embroidery. And clearly, you know, she's an exact contemporary of Rose, born in the same year, but Rose is still doing the same stuff, whereas, you know, Brown and others have moved on to other styles by that point. And, you know, the vast majority of the stuff that we have in the collection is undated, so I at first assumed that all of it would be sort of early, sort of 1890s, 1900s, but then every so often you come across something with a date on it. So this little illuminated letter that she's done was on the back of a piece of paper cut up from an old voting document from 1924. So, you know, she's still doing the same stuff that she had been doing 30 years earlier. But she wasn't alone in that. Stuart Carmichael, for example, was still knocking out Celtic paintings, and indeed had a whole exhibition of them in 1937 to accompany the Highland Mod being held in Dundee that year. And of course John Duncan in Edinburgh was doing the same. So we have this lovely photo of the two sisters, Rose and Nell, towards the end of their lives in the 1940s. And just to tell you a little bit about the rest of the Baxter sisters. So Anne Baxter, who you recall married Joseph Eek, they did various jobs in England for some time, but then moved back and lived in Cooper until her death at the age of 67 in 1935. And I mentioned that the two of them were very actively involved in Labour politics, and the family papers are held in the University of St Andrews, and there's a whole load of really fascinating letters written to her by leading members of the Scottish Labour movement, so Edie Morrell, Thomas Johnson, Jimmy Maxton and others. Really fascinating stuff, actually. Alice, she married Peter Toms. They moved to Ireland, but then he died very young, sadly, in 1914. She then returned to Tayport and lived in a house in Upper Reform Street. After their mother dies in 1921, Rose then left Mercury Cottage and ended up moving in with Alice, and they lived together there for the rest of their lives. Rose died in 1947 and Alice in 1951, leaving Nell as the last surviving sister. And we have two really interesting letters written by Rose and Nell. So this was written to Joseph Eek, Anne's husband, obviously after Anne had died. In fact, this was literally just a month before Joseph Eek died. July 1945, of course, was just after the landslide Labour election victory. And Rose is writing, you'd been glad to have your wireless in working order when the results of the election were broadcast, and I've no doubt felt very elated as result after result declared a Labour victory. Here, hardly a soul has said election to us. You see, we're a Liberal stronghold, and all our neighbours are mostly Tories or Henderson Stewart's admirers. That's John Henderson Stewart, who was the Liberal MP for East Fife. Nell has kept off the subject too, never a word. She knows, of course, where our sympathies lie. So that's quite interesting, because it implies that obviously Rose shares Eek's socialist ideas, but Nell doesn't. But of course, we don't actually know what Nell's politics were. Hopefully she was at least a Liberal, not a Tory, but maybe. And then we have this last, what we assume is the very last letter that Nell wrote. It's the only one that survives, to her granddaughter Jean. This is written on the 3rd of November 1952. And it's obvious that by that point she's basically decided that she's too old to be living on her own, and she's going to be moving down to London to move in with her stepdaughter. So she writes, I suppose Mother told you on the phone that I shall be with them in the early part of the year if all goes well. Dr. Peyton has put his foot down and says I must not be alone, and certainly not in the coldest part of the winter, and Mother backed him up. So that's that, and we've been planning what to take and what to leave. I feel it's an awful upheaval. What to do with my pictures is a bit of a puzzle. Mother wants some of them, but the big embroidery up the airy mountains, so that's the fairies, seems too big for her walls. I call it my sampler and don't want to sell it, though I doubt if anyone would want to buy it. And then she ends, at present I have a heavy cold, but Dr. P says I need not stay in if I want to go out. So that was written on the 3rd of November, and she died on the 16th of December, and she never made it down to London, so she died at home in Tayport. The funeral service was held at Dundee Crematorium, and what she called the big embroidery, her sampler, went to the Dundee Art Society. And at that point, really, she was just completely forgotten, sadly. I mean, even at the time of her death, there were no obituaries published. The Dundee Art Society just briefly mentioned in their annual report that she was an embroidery artist, and that was obviously all they knew about her. And so, you know, it was wonderful to suddenly be given this extraordinary collection of work that has just obviously shone a whole new light on all of her work. And so we're very grateful to David, who kindly came up to bring us all of this wonderful stuff. So the exhibition really is hopefully the starting point of getting her better known, and what we're showing in that is just a fraction of what we've got in the collection. So there's lots more to see as well. So I hope you found that interesting, and thank you very much for listening.